Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's been a while since we've had a solo episode of The Art of Move. Will and I have had a bit of a summer vacation. We're kind of coming back to it. We're hitting full force for August now. And in today's episode, we're going to be diving deeper into a series that we've been doing over the last couple of episodes where we talked about the philosophy of science and how it pertains to movement, biomechanics, and functional training. And what we'd like to do today is kind of give a broad overview of our understanding of and map out the different relationships between science, public opinion, how people form opinions using science, and kind of looking at a broader overall social implication as well of the philosophy of movement science. We're going to dive deep into it. We're going to also look at how people sort of use science as their I don't really know how to articulate this. Rather than try to explain what we're going to talk about, let's just start talking about it. I know you had a clip that you wanted to play that we could kind of segue from and pivot off of. So how about you give a little introduction, some context for what the clip is, and we'll listen to the clip and we'll start the episode from there.
Sure. This is a podcast called PT Inquest. It's a very good research-based physio podcast. And since our niche here of, alternative biomechanics is kind of, a lot of guys get attacked and, attack back to research-based scientists and physios and chiropractors and basically research-based scientists because it's not following traditional science protocols being, research-based, right? So I kind of wanted to get an insight into the other world, into that world. So I've been really diving deep and following which podcasts are relevant and which ones aren't. Seeing the kind of characters on the other side who are spitting some really good info, right? Mm-hmm. So they have a lot of good grievances that they've addressed, but we're definitely deviating on what to do about it. Okay. So this goes in the physio world or the therapy world that we're in. This goes to rehab. This goes to strength and conditioning. All these fields apply, right? And personal training. So everything is built off of the model that we should use research-based research-based science in all those aforementioned therapies, right?
So clinical practices.
Yeah, it's like follow the research, right?
Right.
But sometimes there's not enough research. Sometimes there's faulty research. Sometimes the research is going the wrong way. So following the research is really a rule, right? It's not inherent in nature. It's somebody made this rule and people followed it. Now, if you're a rule utilitarian, meaning that like there's only one way to do things and that's follow the rule, then what they're doing is probably the best way. But if you're somebody who can see the nuance of somebody in front of you, okay, so say that a certain, how do I say this? Like a certain study said 7 out of 10 people fit in this category. And let's say it's knee pain. And someone's sitting in front of me now and I'm the therapist and they have that type of knee pain. Oh, I'm like, 7 out of 10 people have this type of knee pain. But the person in front of me may not fit the 7 out of 10 people and may not fit the 3 out of 10 people that didn't have it. They are a unique individual. So if you're somebody who can have the art of communication with somebody and you can have a better rapport with them, there's your biopsychosocial type of interaction, right? But it's really all encompassing. You got to treat the person like a human being and you got to really figure out through communication what is actually happening there. So you can be a sniper in the middle. You can do the research-based world. You can take the info that's the best there and use it. And you can go outside in the artistic end of it and experiment there, because not everybody fits the model that they're supposed to fit, right? And that's an actual problem in the research-based world, is what do you do with all these people that don't fit?
And this is an interesting point too, because ultimately what I feel like, I don't want to create a false dichotomy of like evidence-based people versus alt biomechanics people versus other people who don't have an opinion at all. I think ultimately what we have is two camps who are trying to figure out the same thing. How do we move well? How do we heal the body? How do we solve problems of movement and function within the human body as it pertains to our mechanics. And what I see, you do have these two camps, and what ultimately what we're trying to do is point out the limitations in the other camp's logic, or the other camp's thinking, so that there is a better, or a better answer that is closer to truth, right? And so what I see, the evidence-based camp is looking at, these people who are doing observations, working in the trenches with clients, have these practical, hands-on, maybe holistic, very interpersonal experiences getting results with clients, right, on the biomechanics sphere. And they're drawing these conclusions based on their observations, based on their experiences and the results with clients. And you're saying, well, that's great and all, but you're making these broad sweeping claims about how the body works without having the science to back you up. And the science is important because it applies a certain level of rigor to your critical thinking process. It allows you to have more variables and more things accounted for, and it's a more rigorous thought process. On the other hand, what I see the biomechanists pointing out to the research-based crew is exactly what you just outlined: is this lack of a humanist approach, like lack of an approach with empathy, lack of an approach where there's a level of like, it doesn't allow for a situational intuition. It doesn't allow for improvisation. It gets to this point where it's so by the book that your creativity in the span of a moment and your ability to adapt rapidly is inhibited somewhat, because you're limited by, it's like, well, I didn't read a study that that qualified this as legitimate, so I don't know necessarily if I can actually take this approach with this person. Or maybe you're looking through things exclusively through this. Basically, it's saying, hey, you both have these limitations in thought. Let's And like you said, you can be that sniper in the middle who is looking at the research, who is taking that intuitive approach, who is in their own bodies experiencing and learning the actual kinesthetic experiential knowledge that guys like David Weck, that you have talked about, that I am a very strong advocate for. There's this middle ground that you can take, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. Is we're trying to accomplish truth, conversation about truth. We're trying to get closer to truth ultimately. And so it's good to call each other's blind spots out in terms of what our limitations in ascertaining truth is, and getting relevant data to get closer to those correct answers.
That's, I mean, put so succinctly, right? I look at this like I'm an investigative journalist, okay? And I've been in both worlds, so I kind of know how they operate. And it's almost like I'm going back to the research-based world now, and I left it for a while. So it's like, what actually happened since I left? Okay, so before it was in the, I guess you could say, the culture to cherry pick studies, right? It's like, I want to do X, so I'm going to find X study, right? And that's kind of how it was used for a long time. And there's a lot of people on the side that criticizes biomechanics that are like, hold on one second, we can't do that. We have to treat science better. And I agree with this, right? Like, if you have a pool of knowledge, you should absolutely get the best knowledge, right? And throw away the papers that were just there for predatory purposes, like, or cherry picking, right? Or call out cherry picking. Now, I think it's at the point right now where people identified that issue. People are in school. It's a lot of the younger guys. They're in school. They're seeing what they're taught is not following science. So they have questions and they're raising them, and it's becoming a problem. So it's almost like a purge of the bad science, in their view, bad science. But what everybody agrees on is that RCT double blind, placebo controlled with sham group is the gold standard. I don't agree with this. Okay. Which is, would blow people's mind, right? Like, right there is the first principle that's like, how could you do this? And when that happens, you get put in a box. Okay. You're in the box with the artists and crazy people. Okay. And you got to climb your way out of the box now. That's usually how it goes. Right. So, humans, I believe, categorize people, and it's hard to categorize me in that way, just because I've lived in both worlds. I can speak on both worlds very fluently and know what's going on. So I just find this stuff fascinating, right? Like, diving back into the world of research based, and I see a lot of issues with methodology that it's just ignored. Here's the thing: people admit it, but when it comes time to look at an individual paper, they'll skip right past it. You know what I mean? It's just like,
Yeah.
no, show me the method of this paper. That's actually what I want to see. If somebody, because this is how usually the debate goes. If it's two research based, scientists or whatever, right? They'll go like, this paper says this. Well, the totality of the research says this. Well, I have a paper that will counter that. And they go back and forth with papers, assuming that each of them have read it and come to the same conclusions in their own head about it.
Right. What's the name of the guy who you're subscribed to his research review service?
Sean Thistle, Dr. Sean
Yeah,
Thistle.
so I was listening to an interview of Sean Thistle with Dr. Andrea Spina. I think it was actually his first podcast that he did was an interview with Dr. Sean Thistle.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was said in that podcast boggled my mind. I just listened to it the other day. I can't believe it took me this long. But he said that, it doesn't matter if everyone's reading the exact same studies. Everyone is ultimately coming to their own conclusions about what those studies mean and their own interpretations of that data. And the other thing is like the amount of people, it's like he would survey people when he was doing classes, and he would ask people, how many of you read abstracts, right? And like maybe like a handful of people would raise their hands, a couple abstracts a month. It's like, how many people read at least one full study a month? And like almost everyone put their hand down, right? Because it's they're reading the abstracts and coming to these far-flung conclusions that kind of fit into this overall narrative. And I think what actually happens is you kind of have more of a collective conversation that's happening that informs your inner narrative a little bit more than even reading the research. And that narrative can shift a little bit. It can sway back and forth a bit, but you need enough people talking about it, right? So it doesn't matter even if the data contradicts it. It's like you still need that critical mass of people who are adopting that viewpoint in order for it to gain traction enough to be talked about as a legitimate, point or variable of conversation within the overall theme that you're exploring. That being said, like that, just to rewind back to that first point of everyone is coming with their own interpretation of the research. It's like you can be research informed, but at the end of the day, the practical application of that research in the context is I still think is almost more important than how many studies you've read, because you could read all the studies in the world. It's like it's the tiger with the cotton teeth analogy, right? It's like you're consuming this information, consuming, but you never actually create a context for you to actualize it in reality, right? And I think the actualization of these concepts in reality is really, really important. It's part of the, you turn into these walking heads where it's debate about data, it's debate about concepts, and it's debate about interpretation of data. And ultimately, one of the things that we got to realize is that, like, even if someone is research based, it's still their opinion about what that they're basing their opinion on research. But this element of the human consciousness interpreting data in its own unique way, you can find consensus with people, sure, and that consensus with people that you're having discussions with can give you the illusion of authority, can give you the illusion of truth, because you have people agreeing with you, but they might not have read the method section. They might not have, you might be looking for different variables. There are variables that you, like, there's a saying, you don't know what you don't know. And I feel like the more you're in an echo chamber of people agreeing with each other and even disagreeing with each other to an extent, right? Like, because like you said, there's the paper thing back and forth. It just shows its limitations pretty quickly.
It does show the limitations pretty quickly, and that is that you have to agree on the first principle of the research base being, they look at it like it's rational. This is rationality, and this is thinking, and being intelligent is finding out what humanity has collectively put into the science and coming to the best conclusions according to that science. To them, that's the best way to go forward. That's the best way to predict the future. Okay? Because to me, science is kind of like, you want to predict the future. I want to know what's going to happen, and I want to know it the best way possible. Right? So they've chosen to believe that that is the best way to do it. Okay? It's a belief. But that's a really hard thing to swallow, right? Because that belief is ingrained in you so much in school when you're at a research-based school that you just look at it like you're more of a beacon of rationality amongst people who are just scattered everywhere. So when someone comes from outside and says, haha, I kind of beat you to it, right? Like, Functional Patterns does that. GOTA does this a little bit. And it's just like, how could you possibly be ahead of the science? How could that be? It's not even possible to do that. It's like, that's an oxymoron to a person that thinks like this, right? Being ahead of the science. Okay. So it's very interesting stuff. I'm going to shift a little bit into the recording that I have, and it's basically talking about the reproducibility crisis. Have you ever heard this?
No.
Okay, so
give me Cole's notes.
Yeah, so in different fields, especially psychology, there was a group from, I believe it was Virginia or West Virginia University, who replicated 100 studies themselves, not amalgamated studies that were replicated, but did it themselves and tried to replicate the studies in psychology. And it was terrible. Like 70% almost wouldn't replicate. Okay, so somebody's doing something fishy somewhere, or someone's not following a procedure properly, and that really stops credibility from happening. The public stops trusting you, right? So this hasn't really got out to the public in a major way yet. However, it's my personal opinion that this is happening in a lot of different fields of science. And I'm going to point specifically to biomechanics and show you exactly how it's being done, or my opinion on how it's being done. Now, a lot of people aren't doing this on purpose. It's not like that, right? Some people do it on purpose. There's definitely examples of many, many different people who kind of change the data in order to fit their preconceived narrative, because it is financially the way to go. It's the way to go to continue your job and your prestige. And you're like, well, I know this is true anyway, so I may as well just massage this a little bit, this data here, and make it fit. And then it's all perfect and I can get my grants next year. There is people who do that, and it's documented. Okay. So there's really no argument here. Now, when I mentioned this, or I got criticism in one of the Naughty videos from somebody, no bullshit physio, and it was that physiotherapy and chiropractic and the those fields, the health sciences fields and the allied health fields, don't have this problem. How do you know? How do you get a double-blind, placebo-controlled study on fake studies, right? You can't really do it, or irreproducible studies. It's very hard to do. You actually have to go and reproduce the studies. Now, one, there's not that many studies to begin with. Two, it's really hard to reproduce a study where you have 24 college athletes who get their, measurements 4 times a week doing squats, right? You can't bring them back and do it again. Or if you do, it's a lot of work to reproduce a study, which you probably won't get a grant for in the first place. So we don't know for certain that there's this issue, but I think there is. Okay. Like, my personal opinion is that there will be a reproducibility issue within biomechanics, sports science, fields like that. Now, I can't point directly to one thing at the moment, but I'll actually, there is studies I could pull up. Okay. But not for this episode. We're going to go a little bit more broad here. Okay. Yeah. Now I'm going to start playing the clip, and we can just bounce off of it. I'll stop it if it's juicy.
And I know you're already familiar with those articles because this is in your space, as you were talking about before. The 2 articles that we have, the first one is from the journal Science, and it was published back in 2015 from the Open Science Collaboration, and the title was Estimating the Reproducibility of Psychological Science. This was a paper that I use a lot in lectures. There's definitely some conversation around publication bias and some of these things, and how difficult it is to get doing a reproduction of a study, so trying to reproduce the results of a study, how oftentimes that won't get published at all. But what this crew did is they tried to reproduce 100 studies, and then they were able to kind of prove a larger point, which was, of 97% of the original studies that had a statistical significance, so that p-value of less than 0.05, when they tried to run them through a second time, it dropped down to 36%, I think, of them had that same p-value. People comment, well, this is psychology literature. We're physical therapists, but to me, we don't have this problem, obviously.
Yeah, you've got your own separate set of numbers, do you?
Exactly.
You've got your own separate set of the interfacing with people.
Okay, so even these guys are like, okay, that's ridiculous that you don't think you have this. Okay, there's no proof about it, but I mean, it's admitted, okay? It's admitted amongst their own debate that this is kind of a problem, right? And the problem goes even further because only 3% or 5% of studies actually get reproduced in the first place. So of that 5% of studies, you have to go and reproduce those. And then, I mean, we know almost nothing, okay? Like for certain. And this is the first problem, okay? There's many other issues going on, but reproducibility is literally number one on the list. And I don't think this person, what's his name? It is James. So this is on PT Inquest podcast, okay? And this guy's name is James Heather. And they're talking about bad science, right? That's basically what's happening. And I'm going to play a little bit more so we can go on and talk about it.
With people to take messy measurements that you measure over time to see whether or not human outcomes change. Yeah, exactly. Completely different. Yeah, it's like quantum physics and duckies in the bath. It's just chalk and cheese. Exactly. No relevance at all, mate.
So we would definitely be. I see us, and I see the commentary around this being more around the social sciences, and I see physical therapy very much fitting into that world. Because again, as you know, a lot of our outcomes, a lot of our measurements are subjective or patient report, and that just leaves a lot of room for this. So. What was kind of the overall thinking of why is this discrepancy there? I know you already talked a little bit.
Yeah, so he goes on to say, basically, when you're working with patients, there's a lot up in the air, right? Mm-hmm. Again, the patient doesn't fit what they're supposed to be, right? I believe a lot of feedback from case studies from the clinic. It should be easier to report those to a central authority if you're under a state system, or if you're under a, I believe in England, physiotherapy is covered by the national health, right? So it would really help if cases in front of you that don't fit the narrative, that don't fit the research-based, research-controlled study or double-blind placebo-controlled study with sham group, gold standard narrative, that patient in front of you doesn't fit it. Why doesn't he fit it? That info should go straight to the national source, so there's a bank for that. Currently, that's not happening. Why isn't it happening? I don't know, right? Like, because they don't look at the person like an individual. They're like, okay, it's a numbers game. It's we want the best outcomes for the most amount of people within a population. Mm-hmm. But I think they should go the opposite way. I think they should go, each individual person is unique. We already have this set of data over here, and that is the research-based data. Whether it's good or not, we have it, and we can see where the individual cases don't match the data. Now, there'd be a lot of data collection going on, okay? But I think that's a good solution to start with. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it would certainly, like you said, because it is explicitly founded on the idea that you're filling in the gaps of where the research isn't. Like, you found this exceptional case. If it's a centralized state system, I feel like I knocked my mic over at least once an episode. Because I'm Italian, I talk with my hands, right? It's a movement podcast. But no, I think it's a very smart approach. It's one of these things where, okay, there are going to be situations. Now, I think the issue that you're going to run into is, will people feel nervous to report that because it's like they're straying away from the mainstream, the safe, the situation, right? Because a lot of the time people will not go outside of, especially if something is state regulated. Like, I mean, you have a chiropractic board, and there's certain things that you can do and certain things that you can't do in the scope of clinical practice. And let's say that you happened upon a patient that, didn't fit the criteria of what you were allowed to do, but you knew there was this thing that you could do. Would you do it and then report it to the board, say, hey, I found this outlier. I did this thing that, wasn't necessarily covered under board policies, but it worked. So what are we going to do with this data?
Well, first off, it's a little bit of a different subject, right? We're talking about what the patient's reporting to you, not what you did to the patient, right? Because most practitioners, even like medical doctors, they're not physically touching you right off the get-go, right? Where a chiropractor or physiotherapist would. Okay, so it's different data set you would get, and it's more reporting what the patient, or how the patient responded to a treatment, or a certain history that they have, or let's say the control group or the study was on healthy 40-year-olds. and you have a 70-year-old in front of you with the comorbidities, but they couldn't put that in a trial because it's not ethical to do a research, for some medications and stuff like that, right? So that's just an example. You'll have someone in front of you that doesn't fit any of the actual study, just reporting the discrepancy is what I'm talking about. Okay. That takes a little bit of an art as well. That there is a human element to that, which a lot of the quantitative guys that are like, we just need to collect the data and get the human element out of here. Okay. This is the area I want to get away from. I want to make things more human personally, less data driven, although you can use some data, but I don't want it to be like in my, utopia of how I would see healthy society. It's not driven by data, because that's a slippery slope in that a lot of the data programs now are AI based, but you have to program the AI to do the correct numbers and hold on one second, and that those numbers were inputted properly. So again, a lot of the data sets are shown. It's like, oh, look at these amazing numbers. Okay. Again, with the method section, it's like, how'd you get those numbers input in the first place?
Yeah.
There's another problem. And sorry, go ahead.
So one of the things that you brought up, this idea of AI, right? And this idea of a human element. And this is, my brother's actually a computer programmer, and him and I talk about AI all the time. We send each other these little mock-up drawings done by an AI from this program called DALL-E Mini, where you put any prompt that you want and it creates an image. And the other day he sends me this video, and he said, listen to this. It's an AI that wrote a Seinfeld joke and performed it with Seinfeld's voice. And it was really eerie to me, because it was a joke that had the characteristic and storyline delivery that Jerry Seinfeld himself would have actually written. And this is something that my brother and I have been talking about, is like, how do you quantify a person's individual style? Like, one of the things that's like really interesting in AI image mapping right now is that it can emulate certain painters and specific human beings' distinct styles. And the stylization component can be quantified and then applied to even more broad abstract variables. So for example, you could have like a painting of a panda bear eating a peanut butter sandwich painted by Van Gogh, and it would look exactly like that. Like, you give it that exact prompt and it would take all these variables. Now, when we're talking about using AI to track something like movement, the variables that we currently use are informed by, the sort of conclusions based on research. They're looking at certain things. We've talked about being on different maps when we're talking about looking at the biomechanics. The way that we're looking at it, we're looking at rotational forces, spiraling forces, force vectors that aren't considered in biomechanics research, in movement research, in rehab research, in the evidence-based field. There are a lot of variables that we consider and that we explore and that we observe that are not considered. And so when you're talking about using an AI or talking about using data, and like, I do think AI could be a very reliable and useful and effective tool. Well, but hear me out, because it can be, it's a tool. It's not the total thing, right? Like, it's how you use a tool. And the reason is because you're able to start quantifying deeper and deeper elements of personal nuance of what makes something stylistic or individual. And I use the art or the AI written Jerry Seinfeld joke as an example, because it's bringing this human element, this individual element, into something that can be calculated into infinitesimal variables by an AI. So it can be useful at getting more data, getting more information, mining more data. But the issue is, if you're inputting only the variables that you are talking about, when we say like research-based and evidence-based physio is not looking at the spiraling forces in the same way that the alternate biomechanics is. So if you're missing those variables, then you're only going to have an AI that's pumping out data that is unless the AI is smarter than the data that it's putting in, and it fills in the gaps and realizing that it's missing force vectors, which, like, some of these image-based and sort of like script writing AIs seem to be doing really well.
Yeah. We're identifying issues without AI. You throw AI in there and it's like a triple, quadruple complication, right? Like, you're complicating things to the max. when we can't even get it right organically. We're not even going through the scientific method. You know what I mean? Half the time. It's the scientific method now is pick out your favorite paper from the bank of already done papers. It's like that wasn't never science. It's like observation, thesis, like hypothesis. Get your scientific mind back to actually conducting on the ground research, like real research, not just inputting AI numbers in and not just or relying on AI with numbers and data sets, because people are pulling data sets from multiple things and extrapolating them on studies, okay, and figuring they mean the same thing, okay. That's going to be the future, and in a big way, because they want to make it more like, in general, it's going to be more technical. You're going to be wearing wearables that are going to give you your biometric data to who knows who in the future, right? Like, so basically it's going that way, and your data is going to be collected, and predictions are going to be made on when your heart's going to go or how you're doing, and you can get the daily update. This is sounds like a great thing, except that it's going more towards the transhumanism end of it. I want to personally get away from that and become more human. Okay. So I'm rejecting all that and going more intuition based, which is a very scary thing to somebody who is numbers based and quantitatively based. Again, the data sets need to be correct in order to have the correct input. And that's only step one. And then basically you have to rely on a AI program that none of you know how to use or to audit. Okay. Nobody can be audited there. So here's the thing. Okay, go ahead.
Let me play devil's advocate just a little bit, right? Because I feel like, the same sort of level of scrutiny that you could apply to AI, in this case, you could almost apply to intuition, because even your intuition is going to be limited to the level of variables and understandings that you have. So say if a research-based physio who is tapping into their intuition is still going to filter through the variables of the evidence that they've researched, and they might, they still might have an intuitive approach, which is this, this evidence-informed intuitive approach, but their intuitive approach, which is their subconscious processing information faster than the conscious mind can do it, this big picture, right brain capacity to grasp multiple variables simultaneously, where the logical, the rational mind, the one variable at a time conscious brain can't do that necessarily, and that's the conscious brain that's breaking things down into evidence and the univariable studies. But your intuition is still limited in terms of the variables that are input there as well. So this is the question is how do you ascertain what good variables you're inputting into your system to access that intuition are?
Yeah, that's the thing about intuition. Like, you have to practice it, right? Here's the thing. I didn't actually mean what I meant by use your intuition is there's two ways to go. You can completely rely on whatever system you're in, okay, for your health, which is really just tracking when you're going to get sick, okay, because there's not that much promotion of actual vitality, okay? Or I can go into the intuitive approach. Now, I'm not talking about in the office. I'm talking about my own personal self and how I would want society to go. That's where I'm going. I'm going more human and less robotic, less transhuman, okay, in that, amalgamating with technology. That's what I actually meant from that. But on the end of it, where I'm in the office, I'm the therapist. I actually did come from a research-based background, so I have that underneath, but I can have somebody in front of me and, because of experience, use my intuition on what would be the best outcome for the person, right? I don't know what would happen if it was all intuition. It would be, you couldn't track anything, or it would be a mess. Plus, there is charlatans out there. There's a lot of bad hombres out there, right? Like, it is reality that some people are out to take your money or, enrich themselves or aren't into their job. That happens, right? So there has to be an awareness within the consumer as well, and an awareness that there are people out there who would say the same things as me, but also be charlatans, right?
So when it's talking about informed consumer decisions, what are the reliable data points that you use to inform yourself? And this is the question: how do you start discerning? Because I think a charlatan is someone like there. It's funny because like there's layers to it, right? There's someone who's legit. There's someone who isn't legit and doesn't know they're not legit, and there's someone who's not legit and knows they're not legit, but sells it really, really well to people anyway because they know how to make it sound. I think that third is where a charlatan is, right? I don't think a person who is just ignorant and giving misinformation and not aware that they're doing it, I wouldn't call them a charlatan. For me, a charlatan is someone who has deliberate malintent to swindle people, essentially.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that goes back to Sean Thistle's point, right? Where it's it's tough in that the consumer does have to make an informed choice about who they go to, right? So right now, what does a person do when they're injured? I can tell you right off the get-go, they're going to go, if they know almost nothing about this niche or even how to fix their body in general. This is a lot of, older people, my parents fall into this category. It's like, I go to a doctor and they say to go to physio. And all physios are the same. If my dad tries one physio and he doesn't like it, he's like, physio, no good. Like there's a lot of people like that, right? That are just like, you're a chiropractor, you crack bones. Okay. And I'm like, I don't do that actually. You know what I mean? I taken a lot of variables. I actually don't even adjust, which is funny, right? Like one in every 30, 40 patients, I might do a small adjustment on, right? Which is unheard of for a lot of chiropractors, because a lot of chiropractors are like, you're a chiropractor, you don't adjust? It's like, yeah, because I don't feel like I never bought into it in the first place. I have different methods that I believe work better, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just a tool in my toolbox. But a lot of other chiropractors would be like, that's what you do. Okay. And the public says that's what you do. So it becomes an awkward conversation where it's like, my last chiropractor said this, and this. Then you say this, and this. It's like, I don't know who's right because you're both chiropractors, right? Like this will, I don't like to bring it to that level. I don't like to say somebody is incorrect when they come into me. I just say I might do things differently, right? But this happens all over the place. And one physio is not always comparable to the other one. And same goes with massage therapists, and same goes with chiropractors, same goes with medical doctors. It's like somebody may be into what they do and you have to care, right? You have to be into what you're doing. You may be doing the wrong thing by accident, right? And this is not the charlatan. This is like somebody who actually cares and maybe listening to the wrong info or info that isn't the best or, straight up incorrect info, right? So, again, going back to the consumer, you really have to actually be a informed consumer in that the best patients that come to me have actually gone to multiple practitioners. They've spent some money finding out who actually works with results and who doesn't, right? Which is funny because it comes back to like, what is Naughty saying, right? A lot of people that go to him have gone through the gauntlet, right? At this point, you do have to go through the gauntlet a little bit. Now, research-based chiropractors, physios, they'll go, PhD scientists, they'll go, well, if we had a standard and that standard was research-based, you would have the best outcomes for the population. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe. And that's what we're supposed to currently be doing right now. And again, only one person reads a paper out of, once a month, if that. Come on, right? Subscribe to Research Review Service, people. It's like you get everything done for you, and it's a hack, okay? You don't have to try to figure it all out on your own because, thousands of papers drop each month. There's not a single person. A person who reads 5 hours of papers a day won't get through 1% of them, if that, okay? So, yeah, back to the argument. Where was I on the last point? Lost my train of thought there.
Go get it.
Yeah, no. Anyway,
I think hold on. I think this is something that I wanted to ride this train. It was this idea of having a centralized authority and having a centralized standard, right? And it's like, well, if we centralized it more, if we had it this sort of big standard, and this is kind of the the authoritarian approach that I wanted to kind of talk to you about in terms of like, well, what would that mean that people who are exploring these ideas individually outside of the system, would they be censored? And would that censorship do more harm than good, right? Because now you're talking about like a standard of care which is increasingly accurate by the standards of the own system. The issue that I find with stuff like that is systems are always inherently corrupt because human beings are the ones running it, and human beings are corruptible and have corrupt tendencies or corruptible tendencies,
or just or in a system that's not the conducive to putting out the best info.
Yes,
they don't have to be corrupt, right? Like,
yeah,
they're just going through the system that perpetuates things that aren't the best system, the best way to do things.
And you could build that system on an incorrect first principle, and then the whole thing starts to crumble, because now there's like a certain degree of reliable situations, but because you built it on an incorrect first principle, well, there's going to be a gazillion other situations, but those are going to be swept under the rug because they're statistically insignificant. But to the human being who's experiencing a setback from having a method not work or being treated like a number, that they aren't a statistic. They aren't just some like a statistical insignificant. They're a human being that are going through pain and want to be helped and want to have want to be treated like a human being ultimately. And I think that's a major discerning point. So in terms of like, what do you think of the utility of a centralized approach? And if so, is there a way to do it without those negative drawbacks?
No, there's no way to do it without negative drawbacks. Everything does have a negative drawback, right? It's like, what's the best way to do it? Right now, the research-based guys go, the best research. We have to clean up, like it's a purge right now. They're cleaning up the bad info, what they perceive as bad info. The guys like No Bullshit Physio, Aaron Kubal, Adam Meekins, this PT Inquest, these guys are cleaning up what they perceive as bad info, and a lot of it is correct. Like a lot of it,
it's good info, right? Like they're doing good work. And I think for me, it's like, good, keep doing this, but also like there's more to the picture, right? And I think pointing out the blind spot of the thinking, it's like, what you're doing is good work. However, there's a broader scope, there's a bigger picture, there's more nuance to the conversation than you're willing to even look at.
Yes, willing to look at is the key there, because it has to fit within the research-based paradigm in order to be in the conversation. And if it's not there, then there's no conversation to be had. But there's differences in technology now where, having a 3D camera would be amazing. If I could film everything in the world in 3D cameras, it would be incredible. You'd have a lot more data, but you're not going to get the real world situation of a video on YouTube where I can watch 20 ACLs next hour, right? ACL tears, and see what happens and actually visualize it, where the data collected from 3D cameras is probably better because you have a better view, but it's in a lab setting. It's sterile. It's not going to translate into the environment outside. Okay. Not necessarily. Some variables will, but a lot won't. So now the technology is there and the sources are there to analyze injuries, and we're going to go straight into biomechanics now. Analyze injuries open source online. Let's have debates about them. Why not debate them? Okay, so debate to me is the key in this whole thing, to actually bring ideas forward and propagate them. I may say things that are a little bit extreme, like RCTs aren't double-blind gold placebo-controlled studies with sham group. I don't think they're the best thing in the world. People will freak out. Let's debate about it. Okay, let's see what actually comes out of that. Okay, I'm open to debate any of these points. So if I say anything egregious that you feel like is way off, please hit me up.
Yeah, okay, and we record these on nofilter.net, and every time we do a live episode, you can actually hit a knock button and you can request to join and actually debate us on these points live in real time. So anyone's open, just send us a message in the chat, hit the knock button, and you can actually join the stream and we can debate some of these points. We are also organizing some debates in the coming month, which are going to be really, really cool. A couple of partner debates. We're trying to set up a few guests. It'll be really cool.
Yeah, I look forward to that quite a bit, because people don't talk amongst each other, amongst these, especially between fields. It's usually a fight right away. Like it doesn't connect because the first principles don't connect. if we can be honest about our first principles and say, this is actually what I believe in my base, and that is that there's only one conversation to be had, and that's research-based evidence. And that's that, right? Now, they would say that what we're doing is like case study at best, right? And anecdotal. So why would you take anecdotal info over research-based info? It makes no sense, right? But again, I appeal to one, this isn't just research-based. We're using mechanical principles, okay? I can scientifically show you how mechanics work. If I always use this example. If I lean to one side's going to have more compression pressure than the other side's going to be lengthened. That's an easy thing to visualize. I can scientifically draw that conclusion by just visualizing it. And I don't need a placebo-controlled study to show me that, okay? So even in the context of what placebo-controlled studies can actually show you, at the best, you can compare variables. Definitely, you can compare two variables, but the principle of emergence being the whole is not the sum of the parts. Okay, so even if you get the right answers to all these variables, 1 versus 1, like each study had the perfect 100% statistical p-value that was at perfect 100%. Okay, even if you had that and then you try to put it all together, it doesn't equal the sum of the parts. Right? So there's a actual philosophical stop to RCTs being a perfect data set in the first place. Because again, it's reductionist. It's assuming that it is a collection of variables that creates the parts, right? So
well, and I think that's really important. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts is a really important point to look at, because even the thing is, even if you test the variables and you get really clear data about the variables, there could be like 50 other fucking variables that you don't even account for. And oftentimes the debates and the discussions that we're having are exactly that. People will pull up a study saying, hey, like this study disproves this idea that you have about biomechanics. It's like, this isn't even the same variable. Like when you talk about, a go to bow being a knee varus, it's not. It's just not. It's a completely different phenomenon that's happening as a part of a kinetic chain that people haven't even looked at, with forces in applications of forces that people aren't even looking at. It's not a knee varus. Like maybe something that looks like a knee varus occurs during that entire movement and that entire series of tensions, but it's not. And this is the issue. It's like, well, we don't have adequate language to describe these things. We don't have this is the problem of functional fitness systems like WEC saying the coil, like Goda saying the bow in the corner, like functional patterns saying the chamber, or saying that your fascia has viscoelastic properties. Like these are some of the, even if you're using the language of modern convention, oftentimes when you're doing it in novel ways, you're using it in ways that aren't being used in the same context as like the word viscoelastic. That is a real word, but the way that Dowdy's using it is very, very, very specific to features of tissue that he observed through creating functional patterns and working with real people and athletes.
Yeah, I agree on that one. Like, let's take a common thing said by research-based scientists. It's that, yeah, fascia is there, okay? It covers everything. So how could you isolate lines of tension like Tom Myers anatomy trains, right? Like, that's not a thing, is what they would say. Since it covers your whole body, you're working it with whatever you do anyway. If I'm lifting weights, I'm going to be working that fascia. Therefore, you cannot work fascia specifically, okay? And I'm like, well, you can pull lines of tension in certain, like, I can isolate lines of tension. I don't have to go with Tom Myers' exact anatomy trains. It's almost a red herring. It's like anatomy trains can't be proved. Therefore, you can't isolate tension within your body, right? Force is the language of the cells, okay? In that, like, that's what Dr. Andrea Spina, right? You can create tensions. If I go like this and pull my arm back, the tension's right here. I can see it. I can feel it. I can use it. I know that the fascia has viscoelastic properties. I know that it's made of collagen elastin. I can use my arm as a whip, and there you go. That's all I need, right? Like, I know that my arm has tension. I don't need a double blind to say that I can create tension in the pec area all the way to the hand. I can see it and feel it, and I can go and I can use it. Okay. This is much like martial arts. Like, why isn't martial arts under the same scrutiny as other movement, to be research based? It's because they'll be like, get out of here. Okay. Because this is how it's done. And this is the best way to do it, because you have to prove it's the best way to do it under the variables there, right? Like, let's say UFC, it's, again, if you went to John Jones and was like, John Jones, here's a research-based study saying that like you should probably elbow instead of kick when that person's coming at you, it's just like, I'm gonna probably do what my instincts are gonna tell me, right? That's it's intuition for them, right? Strength and conditioning is brought into mixed martial arts, and they do their conditioning according to those principles, which I wouldn't do, but I can't make that argument specifically, right? Because I don't know exactly what each athlete's doing. Mm-hmm. But back to the point, it's never brought into martial arts. Martial arts is very, very traditionally, here's how it's done, and here's how to do it better. Okay. And different schools will have different ways of doing things. Now, if I went to a city, let's say New York City had standardized boxing now, you can only box this way in New York City. Okay. And you're not allowed to, you're not allowed to jab or hook, because we believe that those punches don't land nearly as much. Okay, fine. And I go and I practice there. And then I go fight in another city where they're open and they're figuring things out. You'll probably lose. Okay. But a lot of the standards in another city won't be as good. Okay. So a lot of the boxing gyms will have poor standards, but some of them will be amazing. Now, that's how it kind of works right now with therapists. It's like, you may find people who are substandard and, not taking things seriously and wanting to take people's money. And those are the people to avoid. And those are the people and the systems that research-based scientists and physios and chiropractors, they want to get rid of that, because, everybody wants to get rid of substandard care, right? So again, the best way to do it is to standardize it, but then you're going to eliminate the top. So do you want to have a possibility of having a top layer of, I would call them artists, and I consider myself like this because I have a person in front of me and I put all my effort for an hour into figuring out this person's problem. Okay. And I want to figure out what they need. You can't do that in a 20-minute treatment. You can't do that being stressed yourself. So you have to put more energy into yourself. Okay. So you have a higher standard of care, but there's less people there. Now, if you completely standardize it and be too rigid, you'll have a standard in the middle. And this is an inherent problem with collectivized societies, in that you're going to appeal to the lowest common denominator of the standard. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's an issue, in that the people up top who really care, like I believe I really care and I'm really trying to find things out. Okay. And I put time in and effort, and that's more like an art. You're going to lose out on those people. It's going to go back to a standard in the middle. And if you go to a research-based, practitioner right now for exercise, you're going to get progressive overload and basic plain lever movements.
And okay? I think that's why there's, people in the functional fitness space criticizing people so hard, is just saying it's like, you're too standardized. You're not innovating enough, and you're not applying these contexts to the specific situation in front of you, and you're fundamentally limited. That's the limitation I think they're trying to point out ultimately.
Yeah, like for every GOTA, because I love GOTA, WEC, functional patterns I know a little bit less, but I've used their fascial training, or what I interpret as their fascial training, and I've integrated it into what I do. How many of those are there to how many poorer examples where you can point out to be like, I don't know about that? There's quite a few. I would say, 100 to 1. There's so many systems that I look at subpar that aren't going by standard. Okay. So when I look at that, I can see the other side. I can see that the other side of the argument where it's like, let's standardize the research and make it really, really good. Okay. I can see what they're talking about because they're intelligent. They're engaged. They're talking amongst themselves, a lot of intelligent people, but I believe they're putting themselves in a box and standardizing too rigid. And this brings up the point of, how do you control this? You asked me this question before, right? Like, how do you control for that in a society, right? Like, do you get the government to be like, you can only do this? Or boards, do you lobby the board to be very strict in what you do, right? That would be very hard to do amongst the, let's say there's 100,000 therapists out there. You have probably 1,000 who are really engaged. Okay. And that, I'm being generous. So are you going to take the whole, let's say the whole profession and get them in trouble? You know what I mean? For not keeping up with the best research, which is very hard to find. Okay. Because again, you have people arguing. It's like, I don't even know how that's done, to be honest. I'm going to go my own way and still be the artist. Keep going. Okay. And if you want to censor Facebook because I say, something that's not completely research based, then we'll see when that time comes, right? Which I think is a couple of years away, but is coming.
I think we've seen issues around this where, let's just use during the pandemic, for example, there were many things that were censored on social media as being dangerous because it wasn't research based. And later on, not that much longer, maybe like 6 months to a year later, these things that were being censored were like, oh, it turns out this was all true. sorry, we censored you. Sorry, we were giving you such a hard time. Turns out you were right. And this is people who are seeing things that are outside of a collective narrative, a narrative that is focused around safety principally, and an authoritarian centralized version. And I use authoritarian not as a derogatory term. I just say as in, like, there is an authority, a centralized authority that is dictating the rules and the acceptable information, and they're deciding what's true and what isn't. And ultimately they were wrong about a lot of the stuff that they said was true, and a lot of the information that they claimed was dangerous. And at the end of the day, you're going to see that across the board. And so I think, having a degree of censorship, having a degree of centralization is going to lead to those problems down the line, where it's like you need to have more open discussion. You need to have, you need to allow people to dissent from the mainstream opinion, and to do it legitimately and not discredit them just because they aren't going through the same channels that you're going through.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's a tough one, right? Like, how do you regulate this properly? Because I mean, the whole argument of the research based is to follow the system. We have a system of science, research based science, and follow that, and we'll do very well if everyone just adheres to that, right? So they're appealing to following a system. But when you appeal to follow to censor, it's like, how far does that go? Because now you're giving the authority to censor what you perceive now as the proper thing to censor. But that's the whole point of, like, free speech. It's like, you can say things that aren't popular in the moment, literally the whole point of it, right? But you have the right to say it. Maybe people will come down on you, that's fine, but you have the right to say it in the moment as long as it's not inciting violence, right? But that whole argument gets tossed out, and it's like, let's centralize this. Yeah, we should be censoring the dissenters, and we saw that in the last 2 years, right? And the proponents of this would say, thank God we did that, because it would have been way worse if we didn't do that. Then the people who are for the free speech and not being censored are like, you censored us because you have something to hide. So it divides society and makes less trust within the scientific field. Okay. And that's where we're at now. And that's only one reason for that. And I played other reasons earlier, right? Like, there's the reproducibility, there's the blind adherence to RCTs, there's the fact that when you're actually even doing, and think about this, okay? If RCTs are so good, it means that you can pretty much put any info in there, and as long as it's gone through the research-based RCT placebo-controlled filter, then you have good information afterwards. Is that true or no?
Well, okay, so maybe, right? Because again, it could be good information about one variable, right? It could be, and the thing is, it's
Yes.
good information, but information being good or bad is contextual. So I
Yes.
think so yes, you could have good information. It could be very, very good, but is it relevant? It's accurate about the variables that it's testing, but is it relevant? Are the variables and the information and the data you got relevant to the bigger picture? I think that requires a little more nuanced thinking and a little more personal discernment. That's where the issue of interpretation of the literature comes in, is because you could have great data, but what are you doing with that data? What does that data mean?
Well, my point was more right now, it's treated a lot like if you filter it through this RCT protocol, you'll get good information afterwards. But that's not true. Just because you filtered it through the RCT does not mean you have good data. And I feel like a lot of people are dishonest about that. I shouldn't say dishonest. Like, that's not a feature pointed out when talking about RCTs. Okay. It's not a feature of it. And right now, I think there's a admittance that maybe the methodologies aren't that good with what we were doing. And we have to have the correct data to even input. And that is the most important part to me. The correct data, the correct variables that you want to even put into the RCT, which is limited again by the sum of the parts not being the whole, right? Or the whole not being the sum of the parts, right? So, yeah, there's all those limitations. And when it comes to movement, it's like, is the best way to ascertain movement to take two variables and try to compare them with a sham group, right? It just doesn't make sense to me. The observation should start first, and the data should be interpreted towards the observation. So what I mean by that is, and I'm going to give you a specific example. WEC, head over foot. GOTA calls it columns. Basically, your head aligns with your foot as you step, and you're in balance when that happens. The spinal engine dictates that your spine goes back and forth, or is a theory that says your spine goes back and forth. Your head is going with that spine. And if you land with your foot down and your head's over your foot, you're in balance. It's fundamental. You can relax your body, use your fascia to actually propel you forward. Okay. This is my theory. Again, I can't go to a specific study and show you that, but I can appeal to a lot of tape. Okay. A lot of video observations.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
go ahead.
So I want to talk about this idea of observing these phenomena that happen in movement, and even within the alt biomech, you have different interpretations of it. Because obviously, David Weck is saying, well, you're deliberately putting your head over your foot to stay in balance, right? When it comes to locomotion, like I find that I can roll off of this like elastic wave. Like I'm feeling this more than ever. I'm feeling my spine creating this reciprocal back and forth wave of energy. But that being said, I'm also not necessarily deliberately side bending. I'm not actively coiling. And this is an interesting thing where it's like there's an awareness of the position and the bounce out of it. And I feel like the deliberation is more in that bounce out of it, and where I'm, rather than trying to actively put my head over my foot. So there's this discussion where it's like, well, is it a side bend where you're deliberately putting it over your foot, or is it the attributes versus byproducts thing that Devin Brown has talked about? You and I still talk about it quite a bit. I'm in the camp where I think you should practice the positions that you want to be in through movement, but you have to do them dynamically and through movement, and then training the attributes to support being able to handle the dynamic forces that are happening, right? Yeah. And I think those happen separately, and there's a little bit of crossover. That's a separate discussion. But when you're talking about it starts with a lot of observation, but there has to be a good level of healthy debate about what is it that you're observing? What are you seeing?
Exactly. So let's debate it, right?
Yeah.
Where do you see these debates? It hardly any in this field. But to your point about the spinal engine, I wasn't talking about the nuances of the spinal engine. I'm talking about the fact that spinal engine,
the spine moves at all.
Yeah, the spine moves, right? And now, I think it's being admitted in the flexion extension sort of way, but nobody wants to talk about the front view where it's waving from side to side. Okay. Now, again, you can amalgamate these theories. I'm going to propose something here. Yes, you do move your spine, but you have to keep intra-abdominal pressure appropriate, okay, as you're doing it. And if you don't have the intra-abdominal pressure, maybe you could do a little bit of work within your core to get it there, okay? For me, that's not how it works. But that's a way to kind of amalgamate the current theory of keeping the spine rigid, okay, anti-rotation, that the spine is supposed to resist rotation, is not correct to me, okay? But that conversation can't be had because nobody will have it with me, basically, right? People are listening, though. I hear you. You're commenting, you're DMing me. I know you're listening. So let's have these conversations, okay? If you believe the spine should be a rigid column and is made to resist rotation, please come and debate me, okay? Because I believe the spine should be waving back and forth in a fluid manner. And what you're observing, okay, so going back to Weck's argument, he's saying it's head over foot, right? He's not saying why, he's not saying how. He's just like, you can observe really good athletes with their head over their foot, and when your head is over your foot, you're in balance. And an easy way to check is to actually get on one foot, lift your leg, your head will be over your foot to balance, unless you kick out your hip or push your hip back, right? So there's counter movements you can do to make this not true. And again, I can, ski sideways and not have my head over my foot. I'm talking about when you're relatively slow, when most people are doing 99% of the time walking around. Okay. So,
but even if you, and again, the skiing thing, if you measure the force vector of where you are in space, right? Like your center of mass is going this directionally, your head is going to be centered over the foot that has the most center of mass over it.
I'm more talking about what people could, take as a red herring argument on this, right? I'm really just talking about your head's over your foot, you're in balance, okay? And we could see really good athletes doing it. We could see indigenous doing it. We could see fluid movers. Observe, go outside, observe, watch people walk around. People who are stiff, it doesn't look good. People who can move fluidly, have swag, it looks good. It's a natural thing. Michael Jordan, Tyreek Hill, Deion Sanders, Bo Jackson, you could see it everywhere, right? Conor McGregor, somewhat. Okay, although he's stiffened up lately.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So my point being that the spinal engine has been debunked, I hear. But it really hasn't been debunked. It's just been culturally set aside because I haven't seen a debunk. And I believe what's happening is that people just agreed to set it aside and go with the flow, because once you upset that, that's a first principle right there. Once you upset that piece of data, a whole bunch of other pieces of data fall. You're already kind of in a crisis where people are like, can you really replicate that study? The public doesn't know yet, but can you really replicate that study? People are asking that question, or researchers are asking that question. Can you replicate the studies? And we can't add to that. We can't add to the problem of, wait a second, your first principles aren't correct either, right? So a lot of people want to get along in this, but there isn't room to anymore, in my opinion, to not allow debate to happen from outsiders. Because traditionally, scientists do not let outsiders debate. When, back in the day, in like the 1500s, when it was the aristocracy who was the scientist, you think they're going to let a peasant or somebody who doesn't own land get into a scientific debate? No, that was the way it was done there. It was a boys' club. Now it's you're not in the game. You're not in the science. You don't know the pool of research. You're out of the game. And people coming from the outside saying like, wait a second, that's not how it works. This is not something ever accounted for in the history of science, where somebody on their phone who doesn't have an education could be like, look, what I'm seeing doesn't match what you're saying, right? What gives? It's a very awkward place to be in, right? So I look forward to see how this is going to play out. Now, you could be nice about this. I just want to tell the truth here, what I believe is the truth. You can like it or dislike it. That's fine. And again, please, I would love to debate these points in visuals, debate movement, And if you want to bring, this is my one stipulation, if you want to bring studies, you got to send me them first because I want to see the method section, or we can go over the method section together. Okay. Because you can just say studies and it sounds authoritative. You know what I mean? Like, oh, this study says this, this study says this, this study says this, without having to actually open the study up and see the variables. That would be more interesting. I never see those type of debates where people open it up. And I think method sections are skipped over for conclusions, in my opinion. That's
oftentimes
happening quite a bit.
Well, if you look at most most science posts that you see in the movement space, the fitness space, it's usually saying one study showed this, and this study with this amount of people demonstrated this outcome, right? And it's like, well, what's the method? And people don't discuss that. You know, sometimes you see a good method section breakdown, but it's rare. And the point that you made about like the fact that it is just an automatic authoritative statement that it's like studies suggest this. You know, there's scientific rigor behind it. It's an automatic appeal to authority, and not necessarily an appeal to authority fallacy in some cases, because sometimes there is a deal legit. More of there is legitimacy to science. Science is it's a legitimate process, right? But the issue is if you're just taking the fact that someone did a study as the authoritative statement itself and not question the data in it. This is the whole thing. Everyone's making their own interpretation of literature. Your interpretation should not come from the conclusions or the abstracts. It should come from looking at the actual methods and looking at the variables and asking yourself, how does this fit in the bigger picture?
Very much so. I am with you on that. One thing I forgot to mention was p-values. Do you know what this is?
Tell me.
If a paper has a significance of 0.5, okay, a p-value, something called a p-value, then it's statistically significant. You can use it as cause and effect between two variables, right? Like, but it's, from what I've been reading, because I looked into p-values, one is that basically it's an arbitrary number. It was agreed upon number, right? So people want to hit this 0.5 really badly, and you can massage what you do. So if you have a original hypothesis, okay, but your data as you do the study shows something slightly off, now you can go back and change your original hypothesis, and then now it'll fit the p-value at the end. You see how that works? Okay, so that's called p-value hacking. Okay, another thing is that when you're presented with a meta-analysis, and me and you have seen this before, somebody says, look, there's an amalgamation of all these papers, and it conclusively says this, and it's more powerful than just one paper. Now 10 papers are saying it. So the conclusion from this prospective meta-analysis, meaning taking a bunch of papers that say the same, have the same variables, putting them together and making it stronger, this is even better than a single one, and therefore proof that the RCT is the king. Okay? I exaggerated a little bit there. But what if you didn't actually even publish the null results, which is happening all over the place? I would love for someone to say, oh, no, that doesn't happen. Here's why. Please, right. If that's the case, if you believe that people aren't publishing null results, I'd be open to debate about that for sure. Because when I look at it, people are doing this in every field, and that literally invalidates a lot, right? Like, if you're not taking the results that are negative and only taking positive results and then putting it into a statistic and being like, look how great it is, right? That's on top of what we saw when we looked into an example of an amalgamation of studies, a meta-analysis that was given to us that said, look, this disproves, I believe it was Goda, right? That the knee comes in. I got to take a look at the paper again, but I believe it was like Hogan et al. And, it's people jumping down from a box and seeing how much their knees cave in.
Yeah.
And that was proof that Goda was incorrect, because when they followed those people's knees who caved in, I believe it was girls field hockey or something like that, they didn't see more injury afterwards. Therefore, the logic is that valgus, knee cave, doesn't cause ACL injuries like Goda says, that is completely observable on your iPhone, okay, over and over and over again, with 0 black swans, okay? I might like to add that if you can send me a video of an inside ankle bone low, ACL shred, Achilles shred, I would love to see it. I still haven't seen it. I've been
inside ankle bone
for
high.
Or sorry, inside ankle bone high. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Everyone is inside ankle bone low. Okay. Now, again, you could be like, oh, that's because that's the mechanism of injury. It's like, exactly. Okay. Now find one inside ankle bone high and it'll be a black swan. Okay. Black swan means that you can find one counterexample, then it's no longer true. That is very scientific. That's David Hume. Basically, it's like, if you can find one counterexample, then it's no longer true to make the statement. The original statement was, back in the day, all swans were white in England. There was like 40,000 of them, estimate, every single one white. Therefore, when you say the word swan, you imagine a white swan because that's all there is. Now, inmates start going to Australia and reporting black swans. It's like, wait, the statement, all swans are white, is no longer true. All you need is one to debunk it. Okay. So again, send me that ACL shred, Achilles shred with inside ankle bone high. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah. Like show a video of someone getting injured, either with an ACL or an Achilles tendon tear, displaying that particular position. And this is GOTA's this is the basis of their whole argument. It's like, that's statistically significant enough. We haven't had a black swan yet. We haven't actually had a situation where we're observing this pattern and this injury occur concurrently. So that's their whole thing, right? And yeah, I mean, when you were talking about the prospective study or the meta-analysis of all these different studies, when you and I were looking at it, one of those studies that had the highest, I think it was the highest p-value, actually. It was the one that was the highest p-value. The title of the study, I think, was something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, but a box depth drop jump is a poor way to determine or predict ACL injuries. And literally all it was saying that it's like, actually, we just determined that the test that we did was a poor way to predict it. And this was supposed to have this like very, very strong data to prove that the pattern that GOTA is talking about, which, by the way, again, isn't even necessarily a valgus specifically. It's a valgus in the context of an inside ankle bone low with that pressure wave happening, that counter rotation. Who's talking about that? Is anyone going to tell me that a shearing force at high velocity at the knee is not going to cause an ACL issue? Who's going to say that outright? Who's going to look at me and say, I have a paper to prove that high velocity counter rotation at the knee has no impact on your ACL?
Yeah, well, you'd have to measure that, right? That's not even in the literature, probably, right? Like, in science, you can prove or disprove something, right? Most of the time, what's done now is just it's a hypothesis and then put two variables together to show the outcome, right? That the hypothesis is true. What was I going to say about that one? In terms of the meta-analysis that we were talking about, if we were to just look at the meta-analysis and not dig in one layer deeper to look at the methods, it would have been legit paper. We would have been almost like on the train of, debunked GOTA. And if I was in my past, if I was in the past research-based, I would have been like, yeah, of course that debunks GOTA. It's not a thing, right?
Well,
and then that's it. Then you can just go on.
Is, of just assuming that science is the authority, and you can say, well, I got this paper. But again, we didn't even actually have to dig that like as far as the method section. We literally just dug into the name of the actual study and the name. But we did look at the method section of the different studies that the meta-analysis talked about, but we didn't even have to go that far to show that it wasn't looking at the right variables, is what I'm saying.
But the trick was that we went into the meta-analysis the method section in the meta-analysis in the original paper, and it's solid. They actually did account for all the variables that they claimed. They did it really well. It was really well done, but the actual amalgamation of studies that they put in there weren't up to par, weren't actually answering the question, does the cause have the effect? So did knee valgus, the way that GOTA says that knee valgus happens, okay? Collapsing inside ankle bone low and having the rotary energy go in. Anyway, the way Goda says it happened, that is not what was studied at all. And in fact, the conclusion that came from the meta-analysis that the person that put this up claimed was not what actually happened. Okay, so there was a deception there. I don't know if the person that actually claimed this even went to the method section, the second method section. All they wanted to know was it done properly? Right? I think there should be like peer review. The part of the process should be make sure you went through the scientific process. Did you actually do science here? Did you like seriously going through and picking out papers in a pool of research is not science in itself. Okay. That's maybe one method of very recent science, because RCTs and this biomedical paradigm, which I would call it, of having RCT be the king is really not that old. We're talking 30, 40 years old, if that. Okay. So none of this is accounted for in science in the past, in that there was no basically the amount of journals there are now to throw your papers into, because there's millions of journals or thousands of journals. You can bring your paper, you can get it published. Now you can kind of do a press release on that, or if you get into a really good journal, you have research grants the next year. There's no monetary incentive to actually reproduce research. One, it'll be not that interesting. Two, if you get a null result, you're not getting paid. Okay. You may get paid from your university, but you're not going to get the next level prestige, right? Like it's a boring way to do things. So nobody wants to do it.
It sounds like an issue and a limitation of using science as the way to move forward closer towards truth is the financial incentive, and the incentive for notoriety and the incentive for status amongst your academic peers is more what guides it than the desire to get closer to truth. And obviously getting closer to truth will, you know, in some aspects will lead to financial gain, will lead to increased status, because if you make discoveries that are profound and that contribute to the body of knowledge, then obviously that will be rewarded usually. You know, as long as it's not too divergent. But what I'm seeing is one of the limitations is that there's a motivation other than just finding truth, and unfortunately, you know, sometimes that will counter, like you said, people are fudging the data or the methods or how they're conducting research so that their p-value is higher. That's, you know, because they want to have good outcomes for their research. And that desire in itself, that desire to be right, that desire to have the status, that desire is something that is inhibitory to getting closer to truth at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a con. You know, if you list pros and cons, there's lots of pros. Like there's lots of good research out there.
Tons.
But to me now, it's just like I have to actually see it myself, because I can't trust anymore. I can't trust just you telling me. You know what I mean? Like, here's this paper, it says this, trust me. And then on to the next one. Look at that paper, it says this. It's like, let's actually see what's there, because you know, there's more to this story than just research in my eyes. Do you have time to play?
I have like 2 minutes. I was gonna wrap the episode up just because we're already somehow at an hour and a half, which boggles my mind. But
mind blowing, eh? Okay, I'll save this for next time.
Yeah. So yeah, let's wrap that episode up here actually. So in that case, what do you guys think in terms of ascertaining truth? If you're watching on YouTube, I love the comment section on YouTube lately, because we're getting lots of cool questions. We're getting lots of cool takes and lots of points that actually have made me consider things on a deeper level and come to the conversation. These conversations with more insight. So if you're listening on YouTube and you want to leave a comment for us, just saying, what do you think is important when it comes to ascertaining truth? What are the sort of hurdles that you have to go through in order to get legitimate information to make you more informed in a legitimate way? What are some of your thoughts on this episode? What are some of the things you agreed with? What are some of the things you didn't agree with? I'd love to hear it. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes and you want to connect with us and you want to share your takes, our DMs are open on Instagram all the time. I'm at The Body Moves. Will is at The Art of Move, and we always answer DMs. We always kind of consider them as we go into these conversations. If you ever want to hop on these episodes live, we film them on nofilter.net, which is a live streaming platform that you can actually join. There's a live chat. You can ask us questions in real time. You can hit the knock button and join us and debate us or ask questions and get some feedback. This is all stuff that we really, really want to do. So thanks so much for listening to The Art of Move, guys. This was a really, really fun episode to go through. I'm surprised that we went through this much all together. As you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm wearing an Art of Move podcast tank top, which I love. We launched our store officially now. And if you go to The Body Moves on Instagram, go to the link in my bio and you can check those out. And I'll put a discount code saying podcast fans will give you 5% off all your orders. So thank you for listening, guys. Thank you for enduring that little plug at the end. And we'll catch you on the next episode of The Art of Move. We're going to keep going on this conversation.
Have a good one, guys.